She was only 9 years old, growing up invisible. The cleaner's daughter, carrying buckets, while the wealthy crossed the lobby without a glance. Until the German billionaire, owner of Berlin's most luxurious hotel, publicly humiliated her mother. Speaking in German so no one understood, everyone laughed, but then the girl looked up and answered, in his language, with a fluency that froze the entire room. And what happened next changed everything, not just for her, but for all the invisible people in the city. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoy stories that touch the heart and make you think, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell, because every day there's a new story here to move you. Berlin woke to a grey sky, heavy as concrete. The streets were still asleep when Marta pushed open the side door of the Himmelspalast, the blue glass hotel that reflected the sky and returned only shadows. She always entered from the side, never the main entrance. That was reserved for guests, for executives, for those who wore wool coats and shoes that gleamed brighter than the marble she spent hours scrubbing. Marta was a black woman with calloused hands who had come from Brazil almost 10 years ago with a worn suitcase and a whispered promise to her infant daughter, "I'll give you a better future." But Berlin hadn't welcomed her with flowers. It had welcomed her with buckets, mops, and night shifts that stretched until dawn. Her German was functional, broken, just enough to understand orders. She didn't need more, or so she thought. Isabella, her daughter, was 9 years old with eyes too big for her thin face. She accompanied her mother whenever she could, carrying a small bucket and a worn notebook covered in brown paper. While Marta cleaned the corridors, Isabella would sit in the corners, observing. She observed everything, the guests' gestures, the tone of conversations, the way words were pronounced, each syllable, each intonation. She had an almost painful curiosity about the world of words. In the cleaning supply closet, where no one went but the staff, Isabella found a small, broken radio. It only picked up one station, which alternated between news and classical music. She listened to everything. She copied entire sentences in her notebook, trying to mimic the sounds. She used labels from cleaning products, discarded packaging, scraps of newspapers left by guests. Everything became study material. Marta noticed but couldn't understand. "What for, honey?" "We don't need that." Isabella would just smile, a small, sad smile, and keep copying, because for her every word was a key, and she wanted to unlock every door the world had locked for her mother. The Himmelspalast was run by Klaus Reiter, a 50-something German billionaire, with grey hair combed with military precision and a voice that echoed with natural authority. He had inherited the hotel empire from his father and multiplied the fortune with coldness and intelligence. Klaus was admired for his efficiency, feared for his arrogance. He treated employees like cogs, useful but replaceable. He never looked at Marta, nor at Isabella. To him, they were part of the scenery, like the furniture or the curtains, invisible. And Klaus Reiter liked things to stay that way, everyone in their place, each class in its function. But there was something Klaus didn't know. Isabella heard everything. When he spoke on the phone in the hallway, she memorized. When he received foreign guests in the lobby, she took notes. She learned German by listening to Klaus. She learned English from American tourists, French from the event manager, Spanish from the kitchen staff, Italian from the pianist who played during gala nights. 7 languages, alone, without a teacher, without school, without a method, just observing, copying, repeating in a low voice as she carried buckets and swept the corridors no one saw. Marta knew none of this. Isabella never told her. She was afraid her mother would think it was silly, or worse, that she would be afraid her daughter wanted to be something the world wouldn't allow. So she kept it all hidden, the notebook, the words, the sounds, like guarding secrets. One afternoon, as they were cleaning the ballroom after an event, Marta stopped for a moment, leaning on her broom. Her face was tired, her shoulders stooped by the invisible weight of years. Isabella looked at her and felt something tighten in her chest, a mix of love and revolt, love for the mother who never gave up, revolt for the world that made her invisible. "Mom, one day I'll make you truly smile," Isabella said in Portuguese, her voice firm for a 9-year-old. Marta looked at her daughter confused, but touched her face tenderly. "I already smile, honey. When I look at you." Isabella lowered her head and went back to sweeping. But inside her, something simmered. A silent promise, a voice that had not yet been heard, but which already echoed in the walls of the Himmelspalast, waiting for the right moment to make itself known. And that moment was about to arrive. The morning began like any other at the Himmelspalast. The ballroom still smelled of expensive perfume and spilled wine. The previous night's gala had been a success, at least for the guests. For Marta and the cleaning crew, it had been another sleepless night of work, collecting glasses, sweeping shards, erasing traces of luxury. Isabella was sitting near the window, flipping through her worn notebook, when she heard firm footsteps echoing on the marble floor. She knew that sound. Klaus Reiter. He never came down so early. Something was wrong. The billionaire entered the ballroom like a contained storm. He wore an impeccable dark blue suit, but his face was tense, his eyes sharp as blades. Behind him followed 2 security guards and the hotel manager, a blonde woman in high heels who tried to calm him with quick, nervous words. "Herr Reiter, it was just 1 glass. We can handle this discreetly." "Discreetly?" His voice cut through the air. "My guests saw it," the French ambassador commented. "This is a matter of image, Frau Müller. And image is everything." Klaus stopped in the center of the ballroom and pointed to a side table where a crystal glass still bore a stain with dried residue of red wine. It was a minimal detail, almost invisible. But for Klaus Reiter, it was an unforgivable flaw. Marta was kneeling near the wall, scrubbing the baseboard with a damp cloth. She didn't understand the rapid German Klaus was firing, but she felt the weight of his gaze on her. She got up slowly, still holding the cloth, her face confused and frightened. Klaus walked over to her, each step reverberating in the tense silence of the room. He stopped a few feet away, looking down at her, as one might observe something insignificant. And then he spoke, in German, loudly so everyone could hear. "Uneducated people shouldn't be working here. You belong on the streets. Maybe you'll learn how to clean properly out there." Marta didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone. She felt their weight. She saw the faces of the security guards, the manager, the other employees watching from a distance, all silent, all complicit in the silence. She lowered her head, not out of shame, but because she didn't know what to do. She didn't have the words. She didn't have the language. She didn't have a voice. But Isabella did. The girl was a few feet away, motionless, her notebook fallen to the floor. Her eyes were fixed on Klaus Reiter. She had understood every word, every syllable, every intention, and something inside her broke. She took a step forward, then another. Her bare feet made a soft sound on the marble, but to her it was like thunder. Her heart pounded, her hands trembled, but her voice was steady. "Excuse me." Klaus turned, surprised. He looked at the girl as if seeing her for the first time. Frowning, he crossed his arms. "What do you want?" Isabella took a deep breath. She looked him in the eye and answered in perfect German, clear, without hesitation. "Maybe it's the streets you're missing. That's where you learn what dignity means." The silence that followed was absolute. Klaus Reiter blinked, as if struck by something invisible. The manager brought her hand to her mouth. The security guards exchanged confused glances. Marta looked at her daughter, not understanding, but sensing that something important had just happened. Klaus tried to laugh, but the sound came out false, forced. He looked around, seeking complicity, but the faces around him were mute, hesitant. You speak German?" "Yes. And English, and French, and Spanish, and Italian, and Portuguese, and Russian. Isabella spoke each language in sequence, with natural fluency, like changing clothes. Each word was a sword, each sentence a revelation. Klaus turned pale, not from anger, from shock, from something he couldn't name. And then, one of the guests, a young businessman who had been watching the scene from afar, raised his phone and started recording. Isabella didn't know this, but it didn't matter. She had already said what needed to be said. Klaus Reiter, for the first time in decades, didn't know what to answer. He turned abruptly and left the hall, followed by the security guards. The manager stood frozen, looking at Isabella with a mixture of fear and respect. Marta rushed to her daughter and pulled her close, hugging her tightly, trembling. She didn't know what had happened, but she knew that something had changed. Forever. And out there on the streets of Berlin, the video was already beginning to spread. The video was only 43 seconds long, but it was enough. Posted anonymously by a guest of the Himmelspalast, the clip showed Klaus Reiter humiliating Marta in German, followed by the calm and devastating response of Isabella. The contrast was brutal. The powerful billionaire, dressed in an impeccable suit, being disarmed by a 9-year-old girl, barefoot in simple clothes, with an old notebook under her arm. In 2 hours, the video had 50,000 views. In 6 hours, it surpassed 1 million. That night, it was on all the German news. The next day, it was an international headline. Brazilian girl masters 7 languages and confronts German billionaire in defense of her mother. The cleaner's daughter who silenced the hotel owner. Who is Isabella, Berlin's invisible child prodigy? Social media exploded. Comments in dozens of languages flooded the Himmelspalast's profiles. Some praised Isabella, others attacked Klaus Reiter with ferocity. Hashtags like "Justice for Marta" and "Invisible No More" gained traction. Journalists began searching for Marta and Isabella. Cameras surrounded the hotel's side entrance. The pressure grew like a wave about to break. Klaus Reiter locked himself in his office for 2 days. He refused interviews, ignored calls, even avoided the public relations team. He wasn't used to being confronted, much less being exposed, and never in his entire life had he been publicly humiliated by a child. But it wasn't just humiliation. It was something worse. It was the feeling of having been seen, truly seen, and judged, not by his peers, but by someone he considered invisible. Meanwhile, Marta lived in silent panic. She didn't understand what was happening. People stopped on the street to take pictures. Reporters shouted questions in Portuguese. The hotel manager called her for a tense meeting, where she was informed that it might be best to take a few days off until things calmed down. Isabella, on the other hand, remained quiet. She didn't regret what she had said, but she felt the weight of what her words had unleashed. She didn't want fame. She didn't want to be called a prodigy. She just wanted the world to stop treating her mother as if she didn't exist. On the 3rd night after the video, Isabella was sitting in the small apartment they shared, 2 cramped rooms in an old building in Neukölln, flipping through her notebook when Marta sat down beside her. "What did you say to him, honey?" Isabella hesitated. Then she translated into Portuguese, slowly. "I told him maybe he needed to experience the streets, because that's where you learn what dignity is." Marta was silent for a long moment. Then she took her daughter's hand. "Did you learn all this by yourself?" Isabella nodded. "Why?" "Because I wanted to understand what they were saying, and I wanted them to understand me. I wanted to have a voice, Mum, for me and for you." Marta's eyes filled with tears. She pulled her daughter into a tight hug, and for the first time in a long time she cried. Not from sadness, from pride, from fear, from love. Meanwhile, in the Himmelspalast office, Klaus Reiter finally answered the phone. It was his press secretary, his voice tense. Mr. Reiter, we need to act. The company's image is in freefall. Booking cancellations, boycotts, investor pressure. We need a public statement, something to turn the tide." Klaus narrowed his eyes. He knew he had to do something. But what? Apologize? Admit fault? That went against everything he represented. And yet, the silence was costing him dearly. He ran a hand through his grey hair and sighed. "Schedule a press conference. Tomorrow, at noon." The secretary hesitated. "And what will you say?" Klaus didn't answer, because he didn't know himself. The next morning, when Isabella woke up, there was a letter under the apartment door. It was a white envelope with the Himmelspalast seal. Inside, a formal invitation written in German and English. "Miss Isabella and Mrs. Marta are cordially invited to attend a press conference at the Horizon Grand Hotel tomorrow at noon. Mr. Klaus Reiter would like an opportunity to publicly address the recent events." Marta read the letter, confused. Isabella read it too, and something tightened in her chest. "Does he want to apologize?" Marta asked. "I don't know," Isabella replied, "but I think we're about to find out." And so the whole city waited. Cameras, journalists, activists, the curious. Everyone wanted to see what the billionaire would say and what the girl would answer. Because New York had learned an important lesson. Sometimes the most powerful voice doesn't come from the one who shouts the loudest. It comes from the one who has been silenced for too long. And when that voice finally speaks, the whole world stops to listen. The Horizon Grand had never received so much attention. TV vans lined the entire street. Reporters from 3 continents adjusted microphones and cameras. Security guards tried to manage the crowd that had gathered at the entrance. Activists, the curious, Isabella's supporters, Klaus Reiter's critics. All of New York seemed to be there, or watching from home. Inside the main ballroom, where just days before a lavish gala had been held, an impromptu stage was now being set up. Chairs were arranged in rows. Studio lights illuminated the space with surgical clarity. Everything was being broadcast live. Klaus Reiter was backstage, alone. He wore a grey suit, more subdued than usual. His face was pale, his eyes sunken. He hadn't slept properly in days. His public relations team had prepared a speech, carefully chosen words, a calculated apology, a promise of donations to charities, all planned to control the damage. But Klaus knew it wouldn't be enough, because it wasn't about control. It was about truth, and truth was something he had avoided facing his entire life. On the other side, in a small waiting room, Marta and Isabella waited. Marta was nervous, smoothing the simple dress she wore, looking around as if she were on another planet. Isabella, on the other hand, was calm, quiet, but her eyes shone with an intensity that startled even her own mother. "You don't have to do this, honey," Marta said softly. "I know," Isabella replied, "but I want to." A production assistant knocked on the door and gestured. It was time. The ballroom was packed. Cameras pointed at the stage, flashes firing, a constant murmur from the crowd. And then Klaus Reiter entered. He walked to the podium with firm steps, but his face betrayed insecurity. He positioned himself before the microphones, took a deep breath, and began to speak. "Good morning. My name is Klaus Reiter, and I am the owner of the Horizon Grand. I am here today to address the recent events that have gained public attention." My voice was controlled, but it trembled slightly. "I would like to say that I deeply regret any misunderstanding that may have occurred. I have profound respect for all the employees of this hotel who work with dedication and misunderstanding." The voice cut through the air like lightning. Everyone turned. Isabella had stood up from her chair. Marta tried to hold her back, but the girl was already walking towards the stage. The security guards moved, but Klaus raised his hand, stopping them. Isabella walked onto the stage. She stopped a few feet away from him. She looked directly into the billionaire's eyes and spoke in German, loud and clear for all to hear. "Das war kein Missverständnis. Das war Verachtung, und Sie wissen das." This was not a misunderstanding. This was contempt, and you know it. The ballroom erupted in murmurs. Klaus paled. He tried to respond, but Isabella continued. Sie haben meine Mutter gedemütigt, weil sie dachten, sie könnte sie nicht verstehen. Weil sie dachten, wir wären unsichtbar. Aber wir sind nicht unsichtbar. Wir sind nur ignoriert. You humiliated my mother because you thought she couldn't understand you, because you thought we were invisible. But we are not invisible. We are just ignored. Klaus opened his mouth, but no words came out. Isabella took another step forward. Ich habe 7 Sprachen gelernt, nicht weil ich intelligent bin, sondern weil ich zuhören musste, weil ich keine andere Wahl hatte, weil die Welt uns die Stimme genommen hat und ich sie zurückholen wollte. I learned 7 languages, not because I am intelligent, but because I had to listen, because I had no other choice, because the world took our voice away and I wanted to get it back. Tears began to stream down Marta's face as she watched from the audience, not understanding the words, but feeling every single one of them. Klaus Reiter, for the first time in decades, felt something he didn't recognize. Shame, real, profound. He lowered his head. When he spoke again, his voice was hoarse. You are right. The ballroom fell completely silent. You are right. It was not a misunderstanding. It was contempt. And I had never been confronted with it. I had never needed to face what my words do, what my power does, because people like me, we don't need to listen. We just speak, and we expect the world to obey. He looked at Isabella, then at Marta, who was in the audience. I have no excuses, but I have a debt, and I would like to start paying it. Isabella didn't smile. She simply waited. How? Klaus took a deep breath. Tell me, what do you want? Money? A scholarship? I can... Nein? No? Isabella shook her head. Ich will keine Almosen, ich will Veränderung. I don't want handouts. I want change. Klaus frowned. What kind of change? Isabella looked around, at the cameras, at the journalists, at the hotel workers watching from the back. Eine Schule, hier in diesem Hotel für die Kinder der Arbeiter, kostenlos, in allen Sprachen. A school, here in this hotel for the children of the workers, free in all languages. The ballroom exploded. Applause, cheers, flashes. Klaus Reiter stood still, processing. Then slowly he nodded. It will be done. And for the first time, Isabella smiled. 3 months later, on the top floor of the Horizon Grand, where private meeting rooms and empty offices used to be, something new was born. The Schule der Unsichtbaren, the School of the Invisible. It wasn't an ordinary school. It had no rigid walls, no mandatory uniforms, no tuition fees. It was an open space, full of light, with round tables, shelves filled with books in dozens of languages, computers, interactive whiteboards, and above all, teachers who understood what it meant to be ignored. Isabella didn't become the principal. She was still 9 years old, but she was the one who chose the name. She was the one who set the rules. Everyone can learn. Everyone can teach. And no one will be invisible here. The inauguration was an internationally acclaimed event. Journalists returned to the Himmelspalast, but this time with a different narrative. It wasn't about scandal. It was about transformation. Klaus Reiter spoke briefly, but it was Isabella who cut the ceremonial ribbon. Marta stood beside her, wearing a new dress her daughter had chosen, her eyes filled with tears of pride. As the doors opened, dozens of children streamed in. Sons and daughters of janitors, cooks, security guards, drivers. Children who, like Isabella, had grown up behind the scenes, carrying buckets and notebooks, observing the world unseen. Now, they had a voice. In the following months, the school became a benchmark. Universities offered partnerships. International NGOs wanted to replicate the model. Isabella received dozens of invitations for interviews, TV appearances, even scholarship offers from elite institutions. She refused them all. "I don't want to be famous," she said, in one of the few interviews she agreed to give. "I want people to stop ignoring those who are beside them." Klaus Reiter, for his part, changed. Not dramatically, not instantly, but he changed. He started frequenting the school, not as the owner, but as a visitor. Sometimes he'd sit in on classes, just listening. Other times he'd chat with the children's parents, the same staff he'd never looked in the eye. One afternoon, he found Isabella in the school library. She was engrossed in a Russian book. "May I sit?" Klaus asked in German. Isabella looked up at him, then nodded. Klaus sat down in silence for a few minutes. Then he spoke. "You taught me something I never learned in my entire life." Isabella closed the book and looked at him. "What?" "That power doesn't come from who speaks the loudest. It comes from who listens the best." Isabella smiled, a small, sincere smile. "My mom always knew that. I just learned to say it out loud." Klaus nodded, his eyes moist. "Thank you." Isabella didn't reply. She simply went back to reading, and Klaus sat there, learning to listen. Marta, meanwhile, continued working at the Himmelspalast. But now she cleaned the school's floors, and every time she walked down the corridor, she saw the children of the workers studying, laughing, learning, and she'd smile. A genuine smile from the heart. One day, Isabella asked, "Mom, do you still want to go back to Brazil?" Marta thought for a moment. Then she replied, "No, honey, because now Berlin is our home too." And it was. Because home isn't where you're born. It's where you're seen. It's where your voice matters. It's where you're no longer invisible. 2 years had passed since that morning in the ballroom. The Himmelspalast remained one of Berlin's most luxurious hotels, but now it carried a different reputation, that of a place where the invisible became visible, where dignity was restored, where a 9-year-old girl proved that the most powerful voice doesn't need to shout. It just needs to be true. The Schule der Unsichtbaren thrived. Over 200 children attended classes for free. The model was replicated in 3 other German cities, and there were plans to expand to Paris and London. Volunteer teachers came from all over the world. Linguists, educators, translators, all wanted to be part of what began with a worn notebook and a broken radio. Isabella, now 11, continued to study at the school she helped create, not as a symbol, but as a student. She had learned 3 more languages, Mandarin, Arabic, and Swedish, and had started teaching Portuguese to the German children. Her original notebook, the one covered in brown paper, was now framed at the school's entrance, open to the page where she had first copied the words Klaus Reiter had said to her mother, "Ungebildete Leute sollen nicht hier arbeiten." Below, in golden letters, Isabella's response was engraved, "Vielleicht ist es die Straße, die Ihnen fehlt." Dort lernt man, was Würde bedeutet. Marta never learned fluent German, but she learned enough to understand when the other children's parents thanked her. She learned enough to read the school signs, and she learned, above all, that her daughter's voice had given a voice to many other mothers like her. She still cleaned the corridors of the Himmelspalast, but now with her head held high, because she knew her job didn't define her. What defined her was the love she put into every gesture and the courage she passed on to her daughter. Klaus Reiter also changed, but in a quiet way. He never became an activist, never made grand public statements beyond that press conference. But he started paying fairer wages. He created a support fund for employees, and once a month he'd go down to the cafeteria and have lunch with the cleaning staff. One afternoon, he found Isabella on the school terrace, looking out at the city. She was holding something in her hands, the crystal goblet, the very one that had been left stained, the trigger for everything. Klaus was surprised. "You kept that?" Isabella looked at the goblet, then at him. "I kept it because it reminds me of something important." "Of what?" "That the stains aren't on things, they're on the people who look at them, and that sometimes you need to break the silence to clean what's dirty." Klaus was silent for a long moment. Then he extended his hand. "May I?" Isabella handed him the goblet. Klaus held it carefully, looking at it against the sunlight. Then he handed it back. "Thank you for teaching me to see." Isabella smiled. "Thank you for learning to listen." That night, during the graduation ceremony for the first class of the Schule der Unsichtbaren, Isabella was invited to speak. She walked onto the stage, holding the crystal goblet, and looked out at the audience, parents, mothers, workers, children, journalists, and Klaus Reiter sitting in the back row. She took a deep breath and began. "This goblet represents many things. To some, it's an object of luxury. To others, it's just another thing to clean. But to me, it's a symbol of everything that has happened here." She raised the goblet. When it was left stained, my mother was humiliated. Not because she made a mistake, but because someone decided she didn't deserve respect. And in that moment, I understood something. Words can be weapons, but they can also be bridges. She paused. "I learned 7 languages because I wanted to build bridges. I wanted people to hear me. I wanted my mother to be seen. And today, looking at all of you, I see that I am no longer the only one. We are hundreds. We are thousands. And our voice will no longer be ignored." The audience erupted in applause. Marta was crying, embraced by other mothers. Klaus Reiter applauded silently, his eyes welled up. Isabella walked off the stage and headed toward the school's entrance. There, in a small glass display case, she placed the crystal goblet next to her notebook. And below, he had a plaque engraved with these words: "Language is the mirror of dignity, and whoever listens to it learns to see the invisible." In the years that followed, the story of Isabella and Marta became a symbol, not of prodigy or exceptionalism, but of something far deeper, of silent resistance, of learning forged in invisibility, and of a voice that refused to be silenced. Isabella never wanted to be a hero, she just wanted to be heard. And by being heard, she gave a voice to thousands of other invisible people. Marta never learned to speak fluent German. But she learned that dignity needs no translation. It is felt, it is seen, it is lived. And Klaus Reiter learned that power isn't in having the last word. It's in knowing when to shut up and listen. Berlin remained a city of glass and steel, of inequality and surveillance. But in one of its most luxurious hotels on the top floor, there was now a place where the invisible shone brighter than any crystal chandelier. And it all started with a girl, a notebook, and the courage to say, "I exist, and you are going to hear me." Because in the end, it's not the shouts that change the world. It's the voices that refuse to be silenced. And so ends the story of Isabella, the cleaner's daughter who taught herself 7 languages and faced a billionaire with the most powerful weapon there is, the truth spoken with dignity. And you? What did you think of this story? Did it make you reflect on anything? On the people you don't see in your day-to-day life? On the voices you don't hear? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story touched you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And don't forget, subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell, because here, every day there's a new story that will move you, make you think, and remind you that everyone deserves to be seen. See you next time. And remember, the most important voice might be right beside you, just waiting to be heard.